Hi, and welcome to Colour Alchemy Issue 2. Okay, you ask, why should I read comics? Well, I'm going to ask, why don't you read comics? Whenever I tell people that I read comics, I always get the same reply. I used to read the Beano. And that sums it up right there. People think that comics are just for kids. People grow out of reading comics because nobody ever introduces them to the wide variety of comics that are out there for all ages. Even from an early age, people associate words and pictures together as just training wheels for proper books in later life. The reason so few people don't get exposed to the wide variety of comics that are out there is because the comic industry itself doesn't market or advertise widely enough to capture a potential new audience. Back in the 1940s, when comics were available on every spinner rack in every corner shop, they were marketed primarily for children. But over the years, comics have become more mature and sophisticated, but the marketing hasn't. In the mid-50s though, comics maturity received a crippling blow from a collection of right-wing groups in America who considered comics to be a source of juvenile delinquency, or even worse. After a damning few years of legal battles, the Comics Code of Authority was introduced. This was a self-regulating body that effectively castrated several genres and removed horror comics from the shelves altogether. This made comics not only sanitized, but placed them firmly in the pen of disposable entertainment suitable only for keeping your kids quiet. And while over the years the Comic Code of Authority has faded away, and comics have grown a new set of balls, the damage has been done. Comics for a more mature audience had moved underground by the 60s, and anything aimed at a more discerning audience became harder to find. In fact, in the 1970s, the direct market started up, and comics began to fade from the public view altogether. Specialist shops began to open, catering for a specialist audience. Comics became more of a hobby, and less of a viable option alongside books and film. Nowadays, there's a wide variety of comics for all ages covering all genres available in bookshops and online. But because of the lack of industry advertising outside its existing audience, due mainly to a lack of confidence in the medium itself, comics still go widely unseen by a public who, when they go to a bookshop or go online, know what they want and make a beeline for it. Even a casual browser will probably miss or just outright ignore the comic section of a bookshop purely because of the preconception that comics are for kids. After all, if you don't know something's there, how are you going to know you want it? Over the years, comics have come back into newsagents and on the supermarket magazine rack. But these are comics based on children's television programmes and British reprints of superhero comics with the occasional 2000 AD thrown in. And while these may well be very good, and any visibility is good visibility, they are primarily comics for children. So if all the public are seeing are comics for children, all the public are ever going to think is comics are for children. So that's my theory as to why the general public don't read comics. They started out as a medium for children, and as they've grown and matured and become more sophisticated, they moved underground and became more of a hobby and more aimed at a specialist audience. And because of that, people's perceptions of comics have remained rooted in the idea that they are just for children. Ergo, they're not going to read them. Now, in future webcasts, I'll be covering more about the subjects that I briefly brushed on in this webcast, like the history, the sophistication, the maturity of comics, and various other things. But for right now, I think I've answered the question, why don't you read comics? Next, I'm going to ask you the question, why should you read comics? Thanks. See you again soon.